The most explosive moment in 1985 began when Pablo Escobar, the man who had risen from the shanties of Medellín to become Colombia's most feared narco-trafficker, watched a plan unfold that would change a nation's idea of justice. By the mid-1980s, Escobar and the Medellín Cartel had turned cocaine into cash on a mass scale. Their money moved like a second economy. Their violence rewrote the rules. For years, prosecutors and magistrates had chased paper trails, bank records, witness statements, criminal dossiers. The single existential threat to the cartel was extradition to the United States. In April 1984, the assassination of Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a brazen hit blamed on cartel hitmen, hardened the collision between the Colombian state and the traffickers. The country lurched toward a moment in which law, politics, and brute force would intersect. On November 6, 1985, a group of around 40 members of the M19 guerrilla movement stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá. M19, an urban nationalist guerrilla group that had pulled high-profile attacks before, burst through the building doors, took hostages, including Supreme Court magistrates, and declared they would put President Belisario Betancourt's administration on trial. The precise motivations the guerrillas stated were political. The means they chose were catastrophic. What followed was a maelstrom of violence. The army responded with overwhelming force. Tanks rolled into the city center. Troops moved into the palace under orders to retake the building. Over the course of the next day, the structure burned. Gunfire echoed through marble halls. Dozens of hostages, guerrillas, soldiers, and civilians died in the assault and its aftermath. Among the dead were 11 members of Colombia's Supreme Court, jurists who had sat at the apex of the legal system. The official accounting of the dead varied over time, and the final tally was a subject of political and legal dispute for decades. What was not disputed was the shock, a temple of law consumed by bullets and flames. Into that chaos stepped a conspiracy theory that was equal parts accusation and grim common sense. The Supreme Court had been examining cases that implicated members of the Medellín Cartel. There were files, witnesses, and criminal dossiers that posed a mortal threat to the traffickers. Some prosecutors and investigators later alleged that Escobar, anxious about extradition and terrified of evidence reaching American courts, had financed or otherwise supported the operation that allowed the palace to be attacked. The theory held that the assault was not merely guerrilla theater, it was an instrument to destroy documents, silence judges, and reset the course of Colombia's criminal cases. This allegation rests on a knot of facts and contested testimony. M19 members said they intended to put the president on trial and to seize documents. Former members and some witnesses later told investigators that drug money helped the operation. Testimonies and judicial probes in subsequent years pointed to contacts between cartel operatives and extremists who abetted or facilitated the siege. But much of the hard evidence burned in the flames of the palace. Boxes of files and crucial exhibits were charred, smudged, or vanished entirely. The immediate consequence was procedural. Cases collapsed when paper proof was lost, witnesses' protection vanished with the chaos, and avenues for accountability narrowed. Beyond the alleged exchange of money and aims lay the darker dual conspiracy of omission and impunity. Human rights organizations, families of the disappeared, and later judicial commissions accused the army of serious excesses, indiscriminate fire, extrajudicial executions, and the disappearance of detainees who had been held after the retaking. For years, survivors and relatives demanded investigations into who ordered what on those November hours. For years, institutions deflected or stalled. The truth became litigated in courts, in the press, and in hearsay. Were some hostages executed by soldiers after the siege ended? Were there unregistered burials? Did the state use the facade of counterinsurgency to eliminate evidence and witnesses inconvenient to powerful interests? This is the anatomy of a conspiracy that is partly proven and partly stubbornly unresolved. It shows how organized crime and political violence can overlap without neatly admitting to it. Escobar's Medellín Cartel had already used terror as a policy. Killings, car bombs, and the assassination of political figures were tactics to paralyze state institutions. After the palace siege, the cartel's war on the state escalated. Wholesale attacks on judges and politicians, threats against entire families, and the terror campaign that would define the late 1980s were born of the same logic. Law could be undone by fire and bullets. Yet the story is not only of shadowy meetings and hidden bank transfers, it is a portrait of institutions buckling under multiple stresses. The Colombian government was simultaneously torn by a guerrilla insurgency with an urban face, a narcotics industry with near-imperial resources, and an international demand for legal remedy through extradition. The U.S. pressure for extradition amplified the stakes for traffickers. The judiciary's role in pursuing the cases made magistrates targets. The Palace of Justice siege was thus a meeting point of motives: M19's political theater, the cartel's survival instinct, and the state's slide toward militarized solutions. In the years that followed, the siege haunted Colombia. For victims' families, justice proved stubborn. Investigations continued for decades. Grand juries and courts reopened files. Exhumations took place, and some soldiers and officers were tried for crimes committed in the assault. The state itself accepted responsibility in part. Courts and human rights bodies found irregularities and violations in the military response. But many questions remained about the nexus between narco-traffickers and the attackers. Questions made more difficult because the material evidence was gone and because some key actors had been killed, escaped, or silenced. Pablo Escobar never faced Colombian justice for the full measure of his crimes. He surrendered on his own terms in 1991 to a self-styled prison, La Catedral, negotiated to avoid extradition. He escaped in 1992 and was killed in a rooftop shootout with the National Police in 1993. The Medellín Cartel unraveled amid violence, betrayals, and the state's gradual reconstruction of law enforcement capacity. But the memory of the palace siege remained, a scar where a nation's claim to legal order had been tested. The conspiracy that wrapped around that November has the shape of an old, dangerous arithmetic. When non-state actors obtain the resources to rival states, and when judicial institutions hold the power to dismantle criminal enterprises, violence becomes an instrument to erase records, intimidate officials, and re-engineer law itself. In Colombia's case, the Palace of Justice burned because too many actors had motives to see it leveled. Guerrillas who wanted spectacle and trial, traffickers who wanted files destroyed, and a military apparatus that responded with blunt force rather than calibrated restraint. Decades later, survivors, relatives, and judges still sift the ashes of that week for answers. Truth commissions, court rulings, and archival work have filled in details, but some pages remain lost. The siege is a story about a crime that was not a single act, but a collision, of the cocaine economy with the state, of political desperation with criminal expediency, and of a society's institutions buckling under both internal insurgency and external demand for transnational demand.
If you enjoyed this, hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more amazing videos.